In 1922, a British archaeologist digging in the deserts of southern Iraq broke through into a sealed pit that had not been opened in over 4,000 years. Inside, arranged in careful rows, lay the bodies of dozens of women, dressed in gold headdresses, draped in lapis lazuli and silver, with small cups resting near their hands. For 100 years, nobody could say for certain who these women actually were. Now, thanks to a new generation of DNA technology, scientists are finally starting to get real answers, and some of what they are learning is genuinely unsettling. Stick with me, because by the end of this video you will understand exactly what modern genetics is revealing about the women who lived, worked, and died in the world's first cities. And if ancient mysteries like this one interest you, subscribe now, because we dig into stories exactly like this every week. Let's start with who the Sumerians actually were, because even after more than a century of digging, this question is still not fully settled. Sumer arose in the marshy delta of southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet the Persian Gulf, somewhere around 6,000 years ago. The people who lived there built the first true cities the world had ever seen, places like Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, and Nippur, cities of mud brick and reed, wrapped in irrigation canals and surrounded by fields of barley and wheat. These were the people who gave the world writing, the wheel, the plow, formal law codes, organized schools, and the earliest known contracts and receipts. In a very real sense, almost everything we now think of as civilization first took shape in their cities. And then, over the following centuries, they simply faded. By around 4,000 years ago, the Sumerian language was already dying out, replaced by Akkadian and later Babylonian and Assyrian speech. The cities themselves continued, but under new rulers speaking new languages. The Sumerians, as a distinct people, slipped quietly out of the historical record, remembered only through the thousands of clay tablets they left behind. Here's the first genuine mystery, and it has puzzled linguists for well over a century. Sumerian is what is called a language isolate. It is not related to any other known language on Earth, not Arabic, not Hebrew, not Persian, not any of the Indo-European or Semitic language families around it. It stands alone, the same way Basque stands alone in Europe today. So for generations, historians could only ask, without being able to answer, where did these people actually come from? Did they migrate into southern Iraq from somewhere else, carrying their strange language with them? Did they arrive by sea from the Persian Gulf? Or did they simply grow out of older marsh-dwelling communities that had lived in that delta for thousands of years already? The Sumerians left a handful of clues about themselves. They sometimes called themselves the black-headed people. Their statues have unusually large inlaid eyes. Some texts describe a distant homeland in the eastern mountains, but none of this ever amounted to proof. For most of the 20th century, this remained a population without a confirmed origin story, and the only tools available to study it were pottery styles, art, and guesswork. That is where ancient DNA comes in, and this is where the science gets genuinely difficult, so it is worth explaining properly. Extracting usable DNA from bones that are thousands of years old is one of the hardest tasks in modern genetics. The moment an organism dies, its DNA begins breaking down into smaller and smaller fragments. Heat speeds up that breakdown dramatically, and southern Iraq is about as hot and dry as environments get. For decades, this meant ancient DNA research was possible in places like the cold caves of Siberia or the frozen steppe of northern Europe, where genetic material survives far longer, but it was considered nearly hopeless in Mesopotamia. Bones from Ice Age Europe could be sequenced. Bones from the cradle of civilization mostly could not. What changed the equation was a discovery about a very specific piece of the human skull, the petrous bone, the dense, extremely hard structure that surrounds the inner ear. It turns out that this bone protects trapped DNA far better than almost anywhere else in the skeleton, even in hot climates. Combined with next-generation sequencing, the same technology capable of reading millions of tiny DNA fragments simultaneously and reassembling them by computer into a usable genome, researchers finally had a real shot at recovering genetic material from Mesopotamian remains. This is a genuinely new capability. Even 10 or 15 years ago, most of what you're about to hear would have been technically impossible. It helps to understand exactly what this technology looks like in practice, because it is genuinely remarkable how far it has come in a short span of time. A modern ancient DNA lab is built almost like a surgical clean room, with positive air pressure, full body suits, and strict one-way workflows, all designed to prevent modern human DNA, the kind floating in the air from the researchers themselves, from contaminating a sample that might contain only a few thousand intact fragments of 4,000-year-old genetic material. Once a usable fragment of bone is recovered, usually just a few milligrams drilled carefully from the densest part of the petrous bone, it is dissolved down chemically to release whatever DNA survives. The DNA is then processed using next-generation sequencing machines, devices that do not read one long strand of genetic code the way older 1990s-era sequencing did. Instead, they read millions of short, broken fragments simultaneously. each just a few dozen letters long, and computer algorithms then compare those fragments against reference genome databases to figure out where each tiny piece belongs, like reassembling a shredded document one scrap at a time. For ancient samples, scientists also look for a very specific chemical signature of decay called deamination, a pattern of damage that builds up predictably at the ends of DNA strands over centuries, which helps confirm that what they are reading is genuinely ancient material and not modern contamination that slipped through. This entire pipeline, clean rooms, fragment sequencing, damage pattern authentication, barely existed in a usable form before the early 2000s, and it has only become reliable enough for genuinely hot, difficult environments like southern Iraq within roughly the last decade. Using this approach, geneticists have begun publishing the first real ancient genomes from the wider Mesopotamian world, from Neolithic farming sites in northern Iraq, from Bronze Age burials in Iran and Syria, and increasingly from sites tied directly to the Sumerian period itself. I want to be honest with you about the scale of this evidence because it matters for how much weight we should put on it. The number of usable ancient genomes recovered from the Sumerian heartland is still small, often just a handful of individuals per site, sometimes only one. This is cutting edge, rapidly developing science, not a finished picture. But even from this limited sample, a consistent pattern has started to emerge, and it is a genuinely surprising one. The first big finding is about ancestry itself. When these early Mesopotamian genomes are compared against other ancient populations across the region, they do not point to a single isolated group that appeared out of nowhere. They point to deep, layered mixture between at least three separate ancient populations. The first is the original Neolithic farmers of the Fertile Crescent, the people who, roughly 10,000 years ago, were among the first humans anywhere to domesticate wheat, barley, sheep, and goats in the hills of what is now southeastern Turkey, Syria, and northern Iraq. Their genetic legacy shows up today in populations stretching from Europe all the way to South Asia, and it runs strong through early Mesopotamian genomes as well. The second population came from further east, from the Zagros Mountains and the Iranian Plateau, a related but genetically distinct group of early farmers who had domesticated their own separate suite of crops and animals. At some point long before Sumer's rise, these two farming populations began to meet, trade, and intermarry. The third and more unexpected signal traces back even further north, toward populations connected to the Caucasus and the steppe regions of Eastern Europe, hunter-gatherer groups whose genetic markers somehow made their way south into the heart of Mesopotamia over many centuries of contact and movement. Put simply, the earliest population of southern Iraq was never one thing. It was a genetic meeting point, a place where farmers from the west, farmers from the east, and wanderers from the north all converged, mixed, and eventually built cities together. On its own, that is already a remarkable rewrite of a very old historical mystery. But the more interesting and more troubling questions start to appear once researchers look past overall ancestry and start comparing how that ancestry moved through men and women differently. This is where a specific genetic tool becomes important, and it is worth understanding how it actually works because it is the backbone of almost every claim in the rest of this story. Every person carries two very different kinds of inherited genetic material. Mitochondrial DNA passes only from mother to child, essentially unchanged across many generations, which makes it an excellent tracer of maternal ancestry. The Y chromosome, found only in men, passes only from father to son, tracing paternal lines the same way. By comparing these two signals across a buried population, geneticists can sometimes reconstruct something written records almost never capture directly, which people in a society tended to stay in one place and which people tended to move. In many ancient farming societies studied so far, a recognizable pattern shows up again and again. Male lineages tend to be tightly clustered, often descending from a small number of long-established local family lines. Female lineages tend to be far more scattered, drawing from many different, often distant source populations. Read plainly, this usually means men stayed close to where they were born, inheriting land and position from their fathers, while women were far more likely to have moved into a community from somewhere else, whether through marriage, alliance, trade, or, in the harsher cases documented by history, capture. Early genetic surveys of Sumerian-era sites, along with related work on the modern marsh Arabs of southern Iraq, who are considered among the closest living genetic descendants of that ancient population, tend to show exactly this kind of pattern. A much greater diversity and geographic spread among maternal lineages than among paternal ones. The written record from Sumer itself lines up with this pattern in an uncomfortable way. Sumerian administrators were obsessive record keepers. Cuneiform tablets from cities like Lagash and Umma catalog grain shipments, beer rations, temple staff, cattle breeding, and again, the movement of women. These women appear in palace and temple inventories alongside livestock and raw materials, assigned to large weaving houses where they produced the textiles that fueled much of the Sumerian economy. Some of these women were free citizens or temple dedicants, many were not. Cuneiform texts openly record women taken in military raids, received as tribute from defeated cities, or purchased through long-distance trade networks stretching toward the Zagros Mountains and the Iranian Plateau. Those are the exact same general regions that ancient DNA studies point to as major maternal ancestry sources for early Mesopotamian populations. When a genetic signal and a written record both point in the same geographic direction independently, that overlap is worth taking seriously, even while acknowledging that the genetic sample size behind it is still small and the story is still being filled in. Taken together, this evidence suggests that Sumerian civilization, alongside inventing writing and the wheel, also ran one of the earliest large-scale systems in recorded history for moving women, sometimes willingly and sometimes very much not, from surrounding regions into its cities. The women buried with gold and lapis in Sumer's grandest tombs were, in a number of well-documented cases, not simply the daughters of the local elite. They may have been outsiders brought in, dressed and given new roles inside a society that was not originally theirs. That brings us to one of the most famous and most disturbing archaeological finds anywhere in the ancient world, the royal cemetery of Ur. It is worth walking through exactly how this site was found, because the discovery itself has become legendary in archaeology. Leonard Woolley had already spent several excavation seasons working through layers of mud brick near the great ziggurat of Ur, before his team uncovered a sloping ramp cut down into the earth. Following it down, they broke into a large sealed chamber, and inside it were bodies, dozens of them, arranged with obvious care, not scattered as if from a collapse or a massacre discovered after the fact, but laid out deliberately in rows, legs slightly drawn up, hands often near their faces. Woolley recovered elaborate golden jewelry still in place on many of the skeletons, along with the remains of ornate lyres, their wooden bodies long since rotted away, but their gold and shell decorations still sitting in the exact shape of the instruments, with the bones of what were presumably musicians still positioned near them as if they had been playing at the moment of burial. At the head of this group lay a woman identified through an inscribed cylinder seal as Puabi, likely a queen or high priestess, buried in her own separate space beneath an elaborate headdress made of gold leaves and carnelian beads. Around her lay dozens of attendants, mostly women, dressed in fine clothing and jewelry with small cups resting near their hands. For decades, the standard explanation was that these attendants had willingly, or at least peacefully, taken poison to follow their ruler into the afterlife, sipping from small cups found resting near their hands. Modern forensic re-examination has complicated that comforting story considerably. When researchers used CT scanning and detailed skeletal analysis on some of the skulls from these burials, they identified trauma consistent with a sharp instrument, likely a spiked weapon, delivered to the back or side of the head. This does not read as a peaceful, voluntary passing. It reads as deliberate killing carried out on a group of people and then followed by careful arrangement of their bodies into ceremonial poses before burial. This finding, published by forensic researchers working with the original Ur skeletal material, has genuinely reshaped how archaeologists interpret these mass burials. Genetic testing on remains from the broader Mesopotamian region, while still limited for these specific individuals, fits into the same larger pattern already described, of local male lineages surrounded by a far more genetically diverse population of women, many with ancestry tracing back to distant regions, rather than the immediate area around Ur itself. There's a second layer of evidence here that has nothing to do with royal tombs at all, and in some ways it is more revealing precisely because it describes ordinary life rather than a single dramatic event. Bone and tooth chemistry can tell researchers a surprising amount about what a person actually ate across their lifetime, because different diets leave measurable chemical signatures in collagen and enamel. When researchers analyzed skeletal remains from ordinary Mesopotamian cemeteries, away from royal tombs entirely, a consistent pattern showed up. Women in these populations often show more signs of childhood nutritional stress than men buried in the same cemeteries, sometimes from the same households, including growth interruptions and enamel defects linked to periods of illness or food shortage. This does not require any exotic technology to interpret, just careful comparison of ordinary skeletons, but it paints a quiet, consistent picture of unequal treatment that persisted at the household level, not just in dramatic royal burials. The story around childbirth and infant mortality is similarly difficult. Across excavated Sumerian cemeteries, infant graves are extremely common, and estimates drawn from skeletal proportions suggest that a very large share of children, plausibly as many as 1 in 3 in some sites, did not survive past early childhood. Small skeletons are often found wrapped in reed matting or placed inside broken halves of large storage jars, buried close to adult women whose own remains show the physical toll of repeated childbirth. Female skeletons from this period frequently show markers consistent with multiple pregnancies, changes in the pelvis and joints associated with carrying and delivering children under difficult conditions, along with bone density loss consistent with prolonged breastfeeding on inadequate diets. Where mitochondrial testing has been possible, it has confirmed direct maternal relationships between some infant burials and nearby adult women, which is exactly what you would expect. But it also puts hard genetic confirmation behind a pattern that skeletal evidence had already been quietly suggesting for decades. Reading through these cemeteries, a picture emerges of women who spent much of their adult lives pregnant, nursing, or grieving a child who did not survive, sometimes doing all three at once. Genetic research has also picked up something called a male genetic bottleneck in parts of the ancient Near East during this general era, a period where the diversity of Y chromosome lineages narrows sharply, consistent with a small number of men fathering a disproportionate share of children while a much larger population reproduces far less. This kind of pattern has been documented in a number of early stratified societies elsewhere in the world, generally associated with concentrated wealth, power, and control over reproduction, sitting with a narrow elite. Whether this specific pattern applies cleanly to Sumer itself is still an active area of research, and I want to be upfront that the sample sizes involved for this specific population remain small, so this should be understood as an emerging hypothesis rather than settled fact. It would be wrong to tell this story without also mentioning the one Sumerian woman we actually know by name. Around 4,300 years ago, a woman named Enheduanna, daughter of the Akkadian king Sargon, served as high priestess of the moon god Nanna in the city of Ur. She wrote hymns to the goddess Inanna that were copied and recopied by scribes for centuries after her death. And she is, as far as historians can tell, the earliest author in human history whose name has survived attached to their own work. Her poetry touches on exile, injustice, and having her own voice constrained within a temple system run largely by men. Some scholars have speculated that her remains may still lie somewhere in the unexcavated soil around Ur, though nothing confirmed has ever been identified. Enheduanna's existence does not cancel out anything you have just heard. If anything, it sharpens it. One woman, out of what must have been millions, managed to leave her name and her words behind, preserved by scribes precisely because of her royal connections and her position inside the temple hierarchy. Almost nobody else did. For every Enheduanna, there were countless women whose names, whose voices, and whose individual stories simply vanished, leaving only bones, pollen traces, and fragments of DNA for scientists thousands of years later to try to piece back together. There is one more genetic thread worth mentioning, because it shows just how long this story kept unfolding after Sumer itself disappeared. As ancient DNA sampling has expanded to cover later periods in the same region, researchers have tracked what happened to the specific maternal genetic signatures common during the Sumerian era. Those lineages, tied heavily to Iranian highland and northern steppe ancestry, appear to decline gradually across the centuries that followed, through the Babylonian, Assyrian, and Persian periods, and further still after the Arab conquests much later. Traces of that older ancestry have not vanished completely. Modern genetic surveys of the marsh Arabs of southern Iraq, who still live in the same wetlands where Sumer's first cities rose thousands of years ago, show slightly elevated levels of some of these older eastern genetic signals compared to surrounding populations. A faint but real thread of continuity stretching from the world's first cities into the present day. It is also worth mentioning how this research connects to discoveries happening well outside Mesopotamia itself, because that wider context helps show this is not an isolated finding. In the past year, researchers sequencing a remarkably well-preserved genome from an Egyptian man buried more than 4,500 years ago found that roughly a fifth of his ancestry traced back specifically to the Fertile Crescent region between the Tigris and Euphrates. That single genome, published in a major scientific journal, offered some of the clearest direct genetic evidence yet that people and genes were moving between Mesopotamia and neighboring civilizations far more actively than historians had assumed for most of the 20th century. Separately, researchers studying mitochondrial DNA recovered from later Mesopotamian burial sites have proposed genetic links reaching as far as the Indian subcontinent, tied to long-distance trade networks that connected Mesopotamia with South Asia across many centuries. Individually, each of these studies covers only a small number of samples, and each comes with its own caveats and open questions. But together, they are steadily replacing an old, static picture of the ancient Near East, one that imagined isolated, self-contained civilizations, with a far more accurate picture of constant movement, contact, and exchange between distant peoples, carried quite literally in their DNA. I want to end this the way any honest look at this evidence has to end, with a note of caution about how much we actually know versus how much is still being pieced together. Ancient DNA research in Mesopotamia is still a young field. The number of fully sequenced ancient Sumerian genomes remains small compared to better studied regions like Bronze Age Europe, and every new sample has the potential to shift or refine the picture significantly. Some of the more specific claims floating around online about exact incest rates among named royal families or precise disease signatures tied to individual name burials go well beyond what has actually been published in peer-reviewed genetics journals. And a responsible telling of this story has to draw a clear line between what has been solidly demonstrated and what is still speculation dressed up as certainty. What can be said with real confidence is this: the population that built the world's first cities was a genuine mixture of peoples from across a huge stretch of the ancient Near East. Women moved through that society in patterns very different from men, sometimes through ordinary marriage, and sometimes through captivity and trade explicitly documented in the very tablets these people left behind. And the skeletons themselves, independent of any DNA test at all, tell a consistent story of women who worked hard, ate less, buried far too many of their own children, and in at least some remarkable cases were killed outright and arranged for burial beside the rulers they served. Modern genetic science did not invent this story. It gave us a second independent way of checking a story that careful archaeologists had already started to suspect from bones and broken pottery alone. And every year, the sequencing technology keeps improving and more samples get successfully recovered from that brutally hot, DNA-hostile Iraqi soil. This picture is only going to get sharper. It is worth sitting with what that actually means for a moment. For most of the 20th century, the women of Sumer existed in history only as brief entries on administrative tablets, counted alongside sheep and grain, or as anonymous skeletons cataloged by number in an excavation report. They had no individual voice, no name, no way to correct or complicate the record left behind, almost entirely by men writing for other men. Ancient DNA does not give these women back their names. It cannot tell us what any single one of them actually felt or thought or wanted for her own life. But it does something that written history alone could never do on its own. It lets their bodies testify thousands of years later about where they came from, how they were treated, and how they died, independent of whatever story the palace scribes chose to write down at the time. That is a strange kind of justice, arriving 4,000 years too late to help any of them, but arriving all the same. If this look into ancient DNA, forgotten burials, and the real lives of Sumerian women kept you interested until the end, make sure you are subscribed, because there's another deep dive into the ancient world waiting for you right now, and it is just as worth your time as this one was.